I think sourdough is the most amazing thing you can ever make. There, I said it, I stand by what I said. I mean, it's just the perfect bread. And it only has 3 ingredients, water, flour and salt, and that's all you need. With this sourdough, you are using a sourdough starter as your leavening, and a sourdough starter is made with water and flour as well. So keep in mind that it takes a little bit of time to make your sourdough starter become active. Mine took about 2 weeks because we live in a bit of a colder climate. If it's warmer, it can go faster. And you feed your sourdough starter every day with water and flour, and then you take a little bit of your starter, and eventually it'll rise, it'll bubble, it'll double in size, and that's when you can start baking with your sourdough starter. I'm not going to lie, if you first get started with sourdough, it might feel super overwhelming, those steps you need to take, but after you're doing it for some time, it'll feel like second nature. So you just need to get through that phase. Also, it might not work out the first time you make sourdough because it's a higher hydration dough. We use quite a lot of water, so shaping your dough can be a bit tricky if you're not used to it. But that's baking in general. You need to get used to it, you need to practice a lot, and you'll get better every time. And I think that's the fun part as well, because you'll really get the hang of it and you really learn something, and you learn working with dough. And the satisfaction is so high if you're pulling out a loaf like this. To make it easier on you, I wrote a to-do list in the description box below, so you can just check all of the things off while you move along in the schedule. But I'm going to obviously show you in this video as well, so let's get going. Good morning, a little bit of a different setting than you're used to, but that's because it's still pretty early and we need to feed our starter. As you can see, it's already active, and that's because I fed it last night, but I need it to be active this afternoon, so we're feeding it again right now. I always use the same amounts, 100 grams water, 100 grams starter, 100 grams flour, and that's because we'll use 120 grams active starter for our dough, and some evaporates, the water evaporates, so you'll have about 100 grams left that you can feed again. I'm going to use lukewarm water because that helps with the process of making your starter active quicker, because if it's warmer, your starter will be active quicker and your dough will rise faster, and the same with water. So if you use lukewarm water, then everything just goes faster. Make sure it's not too hot, because then you'll kill your starter and you don't want to do that. 100 grams of lukewarm water. The same amount of flour. And the same amount of starter, and then we just stir and put it in a fresh pot. So I have fed my starter, I've mixed everything. I threw away the remaining starter because I don't have any use for it right now. Throw away as much as you can. Don't just rinse it out, because it can really block all of your pipes. If you do rinse it out, use very hot water. So I'm just going to pour it in. And now I'm going to let this be active in a warm place. It takes anywhere, depending on your starter, from 5 to 12 hours. So put it in a warm place if you want it to be active quicker. It's about 5 hours later and our starter is nice and active. It smells a bit like yogurt and old cheese. I really like the smell. Like I said before, it can take around 5 up to 12 hours, and that's a pretty big difference in time, and that depends on 2 things. One, how strong your starter is. If you have a starter that you feed daily and you have been feeding for quite some time, years even, you probably have a very strong starter and it can rise quickly. If you're just starting out, it can be that your starter is not as strong and you need a little bit more time for it to double in size. And number 2 is also the temperature in your house. I put my starter outside in the sun, so yeah, it got active very quickly. Temperature and the strength of your starter are also important for the rest of the recipe, but I'll talk about that in a little bit. Let's just go and check if our starter is actually active, so we can start making our dough. And we do this by testing a little bit in some water, and if it floats, you can proceed with the rest of the recipe, because then it's active and you can bake with it. Okay, so I just have some cold water over here. Let's just grab a little and then put it on the water and it floats. Okay, so that's great. That means there are enough gases in our sourdough starter. So I'm going to toss this and then we'll start with making our dough. I think the hardest thing about making bread or working with dough in general is that you're working with a living thing. Your sourdough starter is a living thing, yeast is a living thing, and it doesn't always respond the same. It really depends on the temperature in your house, on the humidity and stuff like that. So I'm going to show you what you need to look out for in your dough, for the signs you need to check for in order to get the same result over and over again, even if it's much warmer or much colder. We are starting out with 260 grams of lukewarm water. Again, this helps with just speeding up the process a bit. If it's very hot where you live, you can just use cold water. 400 grams of bread flour. Now for bread, I always recommend getting a flour with very high protein in it, because that protein helps build up the gluten network. Now I'm going to mix this just until it's a rough and shaggy dough, and then I'm going to add my starter. And it looks like this. This is just flour and water. Now we're going to add the starter, 120 grams. And this I'll just let sit until tomorrow morning, and then I feed it again with the same ratio as before. So 100 grams of water, 100 grams of flour, and this is about 100 grams as well. I'm going to mix this in my KitchenAid again, just until the starter is mixed in with the rest of the dough. And that looks like this. Now I'm going to add my salt. The myth is, well, maybe it's a true story, I'm not sure, is that when you add salt to either your sourdough starter or yeast, it kills it. So I always add it after everything has been mixed in. Salt in bread is always around 2%. We've used 400 grams of flour, so I'm going to use 8 grams of salt. And now we mix until we can do the Windowpane test, and I'm going to show you every couple of minutes how the dough looks and the signs you need to look out for. So let's mix. We're about 2 minutes into the kneading process, and I just wanted to show you what my dough looks like. If I pull it out, it breaks easily. Look, and it's super sticky. So that tells us that our gluten are not strong enough yet. So we need to keep on kneading to really build that gluten network. Also, if you touch your dough, use wet hands, but this is so sticky, it still sticks to my hands even though they're wet. Let's keep on kneading. 5 minutes in, let's check. Okay, so it breaks easily, so not enough gluten yet, we need to keep on kneading. We're now 9 minutes in. It really starts to get nice and smooth, but let's do the test. Stretch it out. It really feels much sturdier already. We're almost there. Look, it still breaks, but only if it's very thin. And like I said, we need to pass the Windowpane test, and that's when you can stretch it out until it's very thin and it doesn't break. But we're almost there. I think just a couple of more minutes. So we've been kneading for around 12 minutes in total now, and let me see if I can scoop out my dough. Look. It is super smooth, and it is still a bit sticky, but more like tacky, instead of that it tears off and sticks to my hands completely. Let me show you a little close-up. So like I said before, my dough needs to pass the Windowpane test. There are a lot of recipes for sourdough bread, and you don't need to pass the Windowpane test in all of those recipes, but in this one it is important. So if you follow this recipe, make sure you can pass the Windowpane test. Now what you do is you grab a little bit of the dough and you stretch it out. This is why it's important to have wet hands, because otherwise it will stick to your hands and it will tear. Stretch it out, and if you can stretch it out until it's very thin and it doesn't tear, then you know that your gluten are strong enough, and you can proceed with the rest of the recipe. I've transferred my dough into a smaller bowl just because that's easier for this video. Normally I would leave it in the bowl of my KitchenAid. I spoke about gluten before. We already have a nice gluten structure in our dough because we need it until we could do the Windowpane test, but we want to create an even stronger gluten network, and we do that in the next period. It's a 3 times 45 minutes fermentation period, and after each 45 minutes we'll do a series of stretch and folds, and those stretch and folds are to make your gluten even stronger. Now why is that so important? When your bread is rising, the sourdough starter in this case will create gases, air bubbles in your dough, and this results into that very nice and open and airy crumb, which we all love. Well, I love anyway. But you want your gluten to be strong enough to contain all of those gases. So if your gluten are not strong enough, when you put your bread into the oven, it can't hold in those gases, so it will just deflate and you'll get a very, very dense bread. So that's why the gluten are so important. You want to contain those air bubbles, because that is what makes your bread nice and airy. I'm setting my timer for 45 minutes, and then I'll show you how to do some stretch and folds, and we'll do that 3 times. Also, don't forget to cover your dough during this period, because otherwise your dough will dry out. If you want to use a kitchen towel, that's fine as well, but make it damp so that, again, your dough doesn't dry out. And that's the first 45 minutes done. Let's go see our dough. So this is what it looks like now, and now we're ready to do our first series of stretch and folds. So what you do is you wet your hands and you kind of go in the side, then gently stretch and fold back onto itself. And now you stretch until you can't really go any further. Just see where the dough takes you and fold back. And you just go around doing this, and you'll see that once you start doing this more and more, your dough will start to form into a tighter ball, and that's because the gluten are strengthening and they're getting tighter by doing this. And as you start to go round and round your dough, you'll see that you can't really stretch the dough out as much anymore. And now we let it rest again for 45 minutes, and we do a second series of stretch and folds. That was the last 45 minutes. So we're doing one more stretch and fold. So now the difficult part begins, because we need to let our dough rise, and usually it takes around an hour and a half, but it depends on how strong your starter is and how warm or how cold it is in your house. So if it's in the winter, sometimes it took me 3, maybe even 4 hours for my dough to be ready, and in the summer it could happen in an hour. So it really depends on a couple of things, like the temperature being the most important part. So what we need to look out for is some air bubbles in the dough. You really want to see some bubbles in there, and then you know that it's done, and you can shape it and put it in the fridge. So I'm going to check in about, let's say, an hour, and I'm going to show you what it looks like, and then we're going to keep on checking until it's done, and then I'll take you along with every step of the way, because you need to know what it looks like when you can shape it. That's the most important part. I always say, don't look at the clock, look at your dough, and that's very important in this step. Because if your dough has not risen enough, you'll get those big tunnels, and if it's risen too much, it'll become more compact bread again. So yeah, let's wait, cover it up again, and see in about an hour I'm not expecting it to be done in an hour, but I just want to show you what it looks like. Okay, see you in a bit. So this is the dough after an hour. You can see some air bubbles, but not a lot. So let's check back in 30. So this is after an hour and a half. You can definitely see a little bit more air bubbles starting to form and a little bit bigger air bubbles as well. But I'm going to give it, I think at least another 15 minutes, but I'll check in, 15. And this is the dough after 2 hours of bulk fermentation. As you can see, it has air bubbles and also it jiggles. And that means that a lot of air is in the dough itself. So now we can do the pre-shape. I have my Benetton over here. I'm going to put in my shaped dough in here to rise overnight. I have a wooden board because I think it's easier to shape dough on wood. And I'm going to lightly dust it with some flour. And I also have a dough scraper. If you don't have one of these, I think they're about €1 each, maybe not even, but get a couple, because if you're working with dough, you can't not have these. Now be very careful when you scrape out your dough, because you don't want to degas any of those bubbles we just waited so long for to be here. So. As you could probably tell, getting your dough out without a dough scraper, that would have been disastrous. Now, I'd like to make sure that my dough isn't stuck to my cutting board. So just make sure it's loose. But try to use as little flour as possible. So now for our pre-shape, we're going to do basically just the 2 shapes twice. And I do a pre-shape because I find that it holds better if I do a pre-shape and then a final shape. So be careful. And that is it. We let this rest now for 15 minutes. 15 minutes later, as you can see, it's spread out quite a bit, and that's why I like doing 2 shapes. Okay. Lightly dust the top to make sure it doesn't stick when we turn it over, and scrape. And repeat basically. I am going to do it the other way around so that you can see what I'm doing. That is it. I am now going to flour it generously to make sure it doesn't stick when it goes into our Benetton. You can already see those bubbles here. And here it goes. Now what I like to do is when I put it in my Benetton, I'd like to give it a little bit of a pinch here, just to reinforce my shaping. Make sure it's nice and tight. flour the top as well. I have two things over here, my damp kitchen towel and my plastic bag. The kitchen towel I'm going to drape over my dough. And it's damp so that it doesn't dry out when it's in the fridge. And then I'm going to put it in the plastic bag because my experience is if you only use a kitchen towel and put it in the fridge, it'll dry out anyway. And it's now going into the fridge, and the fridge is at 4 degrees Celsius, and it's going in for, it's a little bit after 8, so about 14 hours. Good morning, it is the next day. Trust me, it is. I do look the same, but that's because I just look like this and I'm wearing the same sweater. So, our sourdough has been in the fridge for about 13-14 hours. I've been preheating my cast iron pan for about an hour in the oven. Okay. And here it is. I'll give you a little close-up. This is our sourdough. Let's do the poke test. And look. My indentation does come back, but not completely. That means that it's proofed enough. Like I said, I've been preheating my pan for about an hour, so it's very, very hot. I use the highest setting on my oven, which is 250 degrees Celsius. Now, when we put our dough into our pan, it hits that very hot surface, so the water in your dough evaporates immediately, and that creates steam. And we put a lid on it as well, so that we capture that steam in our pan. Steam is very important when you're baking bread because you don't want your crust to bake immediately. You want the dough to remain soft so that it can expand in the oven rise. If you don't have steam, your crust will bake hard, so your bread can't expand and you get a very dense bread. So if you want a nice and open and airy loaf of bread, you need to get some steam in there. Now my oven is very bad with holding in steam, so that's why I use a pan, a cast iron pan, because you just put the lid on and then everything, you know, is captured in there. I have scissors to cut off my baking paper in the shape of our loaf, and that's just pure aesthetics, because if you put this in the pan, the baking paper will come up to the sides and then it'll create a sort of ripple in your loaf, and I don't like it. And then I have a razor to score our bread. If you want the elusive ear, you need to put your razor at a 45-degree angle when you score your bread, because then you will cut it in the side as well, and then when your bread expands, it opens up and it points upwards. I always check to see if it's not stuck anywhere on the side. Look very carefully. And then just turn it over and remove your proofing basket. Now I'm going to take out my pan. I put it on the stove. Then I'm going to score. Quickly put my dough into the pan, put the lid on and put it back in the oven for about 20 minutes. Here it is. It's very bloody hot, so I don't want to put it on this table because I think it'll ruin it. To create even more steam, you can put an ice cube in your pan, but I don't have any ice cubes at this moment, so we're going to skip that step, but just keep in mind that that's an option as well. Okay, we're going to work fast now, so I'm going to zoom you in on my loaf so that you can see how I score my bread and not really on me putting my bread into the pan because that's quite obvious. So now that our bread is doing its first round in the oven, baking with the lid on with steam, we can feed our sourdough starter. I'm just going to use the same measurements as we did yesterday. So 100 grams of sourdough starter, 100 grams of water, 100 grams of flour. I'm going to start with water. And this is our fat starter. There are two things you can do right now. If you want to make another loaf tonight or soon, just put the lid on, don't screw it shut, and leave it out at room temperature. It'll rise again and you can make another loaf of bread tonight. Or if you want to make want tomorrow, you can just leave it out until the next morning. Tomorrow morning, feed it again, etc. You need to feed it every day if you leave it out at room temperature. If you don't want to bake for quite some time, just screw the lid shut and put it in the fridge. You can keep it there for about 2 to 3 weeks without feeding it. Now, if you're leaving your starter out at room temperature, but you don't want to bake a loaf, there are a couple of things you can do as well. If it's active, so if it's doubled in size and it's at its peak, you can spread some out on a bit of parchment paper and leave that to dry. I always have a little bit of dried active sourdough starter in my house for when I just forget it or don't want to feed it at all or don't want to think about it. The dried starter is easily rehydrated and you'll have an active starter again in about 2 days. I'll put a link in my description where I explain exactly how that works. Option 2 is if you have some starter left and you're not doing anything with it, you can pretty much put it in everything else that you make. In all of your breads, all of your bakes, but also sweet bakes like cookies and cinnamon rolls. It doesn't really do anything. It doesn't make your bread rise, it's not leavening agent anymore, but it does add a lot of flavor. So only do this if you have an active starter, because otherwise if you're just starting out, you need to throw it away because there are too many bad bacteria in there. You could either get sick, and also it smells really bad when you're just starting with building up your starter. So I'm going to leave this out of room temperature, and I don't know, maybe I'll bake another bread tonight, maybe not. In 7 minutes, our first half of the bake is done, so I'll see you in 7 minutes. This is always the most exciting part because now we're going to actually see what our bread looks like. Oh, isn't she gorgeous? Oh God, I love it. Nice and plump, it looks amazing. Okay, let's put it back in the oven for about 10-15 minutes until it's very nice and golden brown. And here it is. I've baked it for another 12 to 13 minutes without the lid so that the crust can get nice and golden brown. Now, very important, you need to let this cool off completely. If we cut it now, the crumb will be a little bit more gummy. It doesn't taste as nice. It dries out easily as well. So you need to let it cool off completely, and then you have that nice, fresh and airy crumb. So very difficult, but very important as well. I feel like it's time to cut it because I am hungry. Let's just do one right down the middle. So exciting. It's always just exciting to see what it looks like. Ooh, let me show you up close. Oh, it's awesome. It smells so good. It is perfect. Look at this. Yum, yum. To end this video, I wanted to give you some general tips, some tips about baking. My laptop is right over there because otherwise I'm not going to remember them all. But first thing is get flour with the highest protein level you can get. The protein is what makes the gluten network, and you want as much of that as possible. So get at least like 12 grams of protein per 100 grams. Second tip, temperature. I've said it in this video before, but temperature is very important. If the temperature is higher, your dough will rise faster, so keep that in mind. Yesterday it was quite cold here. It was about 19 degrees, while the perfect temperature for sourdough is somewhere between 21 and 25 Celsius. So it took me a little bit longer to get my dough ready, but as I showed you, just look out for those signs. Because your dough is showing you when it's ready to go into the oven and to go into the fridge. But temperature is very important, so keep that in mind. If you're kneading your dough, never add any flour, even if it's super sticky. That's why I always knead with my KitchenAid, because I don't like the mess on my hands. But never add any flour, because your bread will be more compact if you add flour. It will be more dense, but also the flour you added later on, the gluten in that flour has not been developed yet. So you're kind of ruining your bread. So just try to keep on kneading and don't think about how sticky it is, because that will eventually get less if the gluten have developed enough. I believe I've said it before in this video, but shaping can be quite challenging. especially with a higher hydration loaf like this, but it is very important because if you get that nice tight shape, then your bread doesn't spread out as much when it gets out of the proofing basket, and you'll have a nice little high loaf of bread. Also, if it's not perfect the first time, it's fine. Working with bread and working with dough is all about learning, and you learn by doing, so just keep on practicing. And lastly, if you work with dough, always wet your hands when you touch it because that prevents it from sticking to your hands. And it doesn't matter if you add more water to your dough, because the wetter the better. It sounds gross, but you know, the water, the higher hydration is what makes your dough so nice and open. So water is always a good thing, so wet your hands.